So indeed, I would like to share this topic today, which I have done in collaboration with the colleagues that you can see here. I would like to start the talk with a disclaimer. So I am not really an expert on numerical relativity, even though the words numerical relativity are in the title of the talk. My experience is instead mostly what is written in this slide. So my experience is mainly on general relativistic magnetohydrodynamics. So in this field, I have contributed one of the main developers to this code, the Laplace friction code back. You can see a simulation of this code here. And I have applied this code in order to help building the library of simulations of the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration that was used in turn to interpret the first images of black holes, as the one that you can see here. So the topics that on which I am working now are on accretion on exotic compact objects to see what would be the observational appearance of objects such as boson stars, Broca stars, and other objects that the people in the group of Aveiro studies. And so here's a simulated appearance of a boson star. And I am also working on large-scale informal accretion patterns. So this means in most simulations, people start with an accretion disk that is already close to the black hole. But well, this other kind of simulation setup that I am starting to study, you don't start with the torus, but you let it form organically from matter that is injected from the larger scale. So, well, however, I have been in contact with numerical relativity to some extent. So during the master, I made some simulations of in spherical geometry, in spherical symmetry, sorry, of using the BSSM formulation, and especially while I was at Luciano Brezzola's group in Frankfurt, I talked many times with colleagues that were doing numerical relativity. And in fact, this project came as a result of these nice conversations with the colleagues that I had there. All of the people that is in this list were my fellow PhD students at that time. And so the work that this work is also published in this paper from 2022, but it is also an ongoing project because there are many things that we still want to study and many things that we need to solve. So, well, so I would start also would like to start by introducing the 3+1 formulation, because the first similitude between MHD, the Maxwell equations, and gravitation will be on what happens when you take the equations that are in four-dimensional spaces and you project it you write them in a way that you can evolve separating space from time. So this is what the 3+1 split is for. You have the four-dimensional space, and as mentioned, well, most people here know. Then you foliate it into a lot of spatial hypersurfaces that are characterized by a normal vector and by a metric that is induced on the hypersurface. Then you use this normal vector and that induced metric in order to project the tensors, vectors, and every quantity, in order to have expressions that are in which you have separated space from time, and you can put into a code and it can evolve in time. So when we apply this decomposition to these different theories or these different systems of equations, Einstein, Maxwell, and ideal magnetohydrodynamics, it turns out that we end with a set of evolution equations, but also a set of constraints that we need to fulfill during evolution. For the case of the Maxwell equation, the evolution equations are Ampere-Maxwell and Faraday's law, and the constraint equations are the Gauss law for electricity and magnetism. These need to be satisfied even if we don't evolve them, because otherwise what we have is not a solution to the Maxwell equation. In the case of ideal magnetohydrodynamics, we also have, well, the evolution equations are the transport of mass and energy momentum, and also the Faraday law from the Maxwell equation. And our constraints are that these quantities need to be conserved globally, and that also the Gauss law for magnetism needs to be satisfied. Finally, for the case of the Einstein field equations, after we apply the 3+1 decomposition, we have the set of evolution equations for the three-metric and exclusive curvature, and we have to satisfy at every time set the Hamiltonian and the momentum constraints. So, well, however, in this, even though these systems share this similitude, there are a lot of things that appear to be much easier to do in while solving numerically the Maxwell equations and the equations of ideal MHD than when solving the Einstein equations. So there are many items in this list, but I would like to start by looking at the treatment of constraints precisely. So in numerical relativity simulations, there are three approaches, or well, actually just two approaches that one could take when dealing with the constraints in evolution. Well, actually, maybe there are more, but I put these two to give an example. So approach zero is not to not do anything about the constraint. This is what one has, for example, in unstable evolutions as the one given by the ADM system. You don't do anything. At some point, the system, well, the simulation explodes, and this is because the system is not well posed. It is, one would say that it is not hyperbolic. Then in approach one can also do nothing about the constraints, but one can use the constraints to some extent in our favor in order to rewrite the equations in a more favorable way that is more stable, evolution. This is what one does in the case of the BSSN formulation. Finally, approach two is to add additional equations in order to dump the constraints and propagate them away. This is what is done formulations such as Z4, Z4, Z4. And you can see here, these are violations of the Hamiltonian constraints in a simulation of a Newton star merger. And you can see here, comparison between when you use a formulation that dumps the constraints away and propagate it, and a formulation that doesn't do anything about the constraints, which in this case is BSSN. However, if you look to yes.
What are these lines? For example, on the left, this is the vessel. What are these lines on the left?
These lines?
On the left.
These lines?
Yeah, for example.
Yes, I think so. This is the Gauss violations in the initial data, and I think these are just part where the violation to the constraints goes from positive to negative, because this is the norm of the constraint violations. So in some places it is positive, in other places it's negative, and where it goes close to zero, you see a line where there is a mean. So, well, then I was saying that, however, if you go to the case of MHD, for example, there is a third way of dealing with the constraints, and this is by building constraint preserving discretizations. In the case of ideal MHD, there are two algorithms that do this kind of thing. These are the finite volume algorithm that is used for solving the fluid equation, and constraint transport, which is used to solve the Faraday equation. So this is the end state of a simulation of a system that is called the Orszag-Tan vortex. This system is a bit, it's somehow challenging, and is used a bit as a benchmark because it has magnetic turbulence, shocks, and also magnetic reconnection. So, it has quite some challenging dynamics. And what you can see here at the right is a plot of the constraint violation for this simulation. So as you can see here, the constraint violations are in the order of the zeros of the double precision representation of numbers. So the constraint violations don't go with the order of the method. They don't go with third order or fourth order, etc. But they go with the highest precision that the machine can deliver. So this is the same simulation, but now done with another approach to enforce the constraints, which is the analog of constraint damping. This is called generalized Lagrange multiplier. So here is the then state of the simulation. This is the magnetic field strength. Here are the constraint violations for this kind of constraint damping approach. You can see that they are in the order of 10 to the minus 1, 10 to the minus 2 of the norm of the magnetic field. And here are with the constraint preserving discretization, which in this case is the flux constraint transport approach. They are of the order of 10 to the minus 14, or even, well, in this range. It may seem that these simulations actually look quite similar, and it doesn't matter whether you have a discretization that is constraint preserving or not. But if you look quantitatively at the profile, you see some differences. And for example, in this other plot, this is supposed to simulate a solution that is stationary. This is a spherical accretion onto a black hole. And this is the density profile. And as you can see here, in the case where constraint preserving discretization was used, you can evolve the system up to 100 gravitational timescales, and the solution still looks perfectly stationary. But if you instead use the constraint damping approach, you'll see some places where, well, something has happened, so stationarity was not respected. So, but this is just one case. There are several other things that are relatively easy to do in MHD or in numerical electrodynamics, and are very well and are much more complicated when you try to do them for numerical relativity. So we already talked about this, but there is also the issue of constraint fulfilling initial data. In MHD or Maxwell equations, it is relatively easy to construct constraint fulfilling initial data. If you have a purely magnetic field, you just initialize it from a vector potential, and you automatically have zero divergence. If you have some charge, you can use a Poisson solver, and you have a constraint fulfilling initial field. But for the case of general relativity, you have to resort to more complicated techniques such as spectral solvers, and even the finding of initial data has been elevated to a Kurzul field inside the numerical relativity. So this is one other item. This we will talk later. But other items are, for example, non-Cartesian coordinates or unstructured measures. This is also not so common because it is a bit challenging in numerical relativity and n-body simulation. So well, these are also relatively difficult to find in the numerical relativity literature. And then one could ask, why is that this happens? If one thinks of it, the reason why these things are easy or relatively easy to do in MHD and numerical electrodynamics is because the equations satisfy they have some very nice properties. So they form systems that are first order. The equations can be put in a form that is flux conserving, and it is possible to construct constraint preserving discretizations. But if one thinks a bit more deeply on why is the reason why this is possible, so one level of why beyond, one can find that actually the reason is related to the geometrical meaning of the quantities that are in the equations. So then for the rest of this talk, I will for some part of this talk I will talk about the exterior calculus and differential form, which are precisely the objects that are the branch of mathematics that was used more to represent objects such as fluxes, densities, surface integrals, and all of these things that represent that are made to represent these physical systems, no? Magnetic fluxes, mass fluxes, etc. So, I know that many people is familiar with this in this room, but just to, I would just like to make a quick recap on this. So, in general, differential forms are integrants over manifolds of different dimensionality. So in general, you can talk about P forms. That is an integrand over a submanifold of dimension P. So, for example, these are one forms. This A is a one form. It is an integrand over a one-dimensional submanifold that is a line integrand. And you can also write it in this way. So writing it in this way already suggests that these integrands form a vector space. So you can take these differentials as a basis of this vector space, and of these coefficients are the components of each vector. So there are basis vectors. And you can also make change of basis and write another basis via a matrix transformation from this basis. And you can use this, for example, to transform from a basis that is coordinate to a basis that is orthonormal. Then, one can go one order above, and there are two forms. This would be the vector space of integrand over oriented submanifolds. Oriented then means that you can define a normal direction that can be in one direction or in the other direction. These share the vector space of four-dimensional vector. In this case, two forms share the vector space of antisymmetric rank 0-2 tensors, and this goes on at every order, and for completeness, zero forms are scalars. So then one property that is interesting about these P forms for our purposes is that they provide a map from non-overlapping P-dimensional submanifolds into real numbers. That is, let's say that we have a submanifold a manifold that is like this. Well, this is also submanifold, but if we divide it and we perform an integral over this part, and also we perform an integral over this part, this integrand will, when integrated, will give a real number. This other region, when integrated, it will be another real number. And if you make the integrand over the full space, and you get the same number as if you just add these two numbers. So so integration of P forms provides a map from non-overlapping manifolds into real numbers, and that is important for constructing discretization. So at least we will come later to this, but then. As I mentioned, they have the same vector space as 0P totally antisymmetric tensors. For example, in 4D, this means that the vector spaces of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 have dimensions 1, 4, 6, 4, and 1. And then the fact that this has the same dimension as this, and this has the same dimension as this, suggests that it is possible also to create another map that connects 0 forms with 4 forms and 3 forms with 4 forms. And this map is called the Hodge duality, which consists of scrambling a bit the components of this form with this other object that are the components of what is called the volume form. So one can also, these forms also have the algebra. One can construct forms of higher rank by using the zero product. One also reduce the rank of a P form by using the zero product and contracting with a vector. So this is what is shown here. Finally, the last object that is important to introduce is the zero derivative. So this derivative is defined in such a way that this antiderivative is an integral over a P-dimensional submanifold. So in this sense, it is it satisfies like a generalized version of the fundamental theorem of calculus. So in the fundamental theory of calculus, if you replace the evaluation of an integral by the subtraction of what lies at the boundary, that in that case are 2 points. But if you go to higher dimensions, then what you fulfill is this Stokes theorem. So in general, if you want to know what is the integral of a zero derivative of a differential form, you just evaluate the differential form at the boundaries of that submanifold. This zero derivative satisfies the Leibniz rule with the zero product. It is also nilpotent, so you apply 2 times, it will give 0, which is what in the book by Mr. Thorne and Wheeler they say the boundary of a boundary is 0, and you can see that schematically drawn here. So if you have some differential form that is defined over this region, and you calculate its zero derivative, that the zero derivative will give a differential form that is defined on this this other on the boundary of this region. If you calculate the zero derivative again, it will give a differential form that has to be evaluated here. But as this point concept with this point, then you have no boundary, and then everything is is 0. And this is very convenient if one wants to write system of equation in terms of zero derivative, because this property will ensure that systems of equations in the zero derivative will be always first order system. And finally, the last relation that I would like to present on this mathematics digression is the Cartan's magic formula, which relates the Lie derivative with the exterior derivative and the interior product. And this is important because for numerical relativity or for relativity in general, one can write time evolutions as Lie derivatives along a vector field. So, well, I would like to go more into details about this discretization by integration that I mentioned, because this is quite different from typical discretizations that one tries to do when solving partial differential equations. So many times one uses one discretizes using the finely different approximation, and so in these approximations, the finely difference are correct, let's say, the order of the method. But when you do discretizations in this way, here no approximation was done, but one has mapped something that was continuous, that is the integrand and the manifold, into something that is already a real number. And well, then we start with differential conservation equations, and we end with the derived equations that are for some integrated and boundary integrated quantities. And so this allows to some extent discretization without approximation, but we will see soon that there is a price that one has to pay for this. So I don't know how much time I have because
35 minutes or 30 minutes more.
30 minutes. Okay. So maybe we can start that. Maybe I have time. I hope to have time to show an example of how this works in the case of the wave equation. Well, the wave equation is written here. So this is how you write the wave equation in an arbitrary space. So now you can rewrite this also in terms of differential forms by making some definition. So you start with something that is a scalar field, so a zero form. Then you construct a one form by taking the exterior derivative of this scalar field. So this, according to the definition of the exterior derivative, is just what one would call the gradient of the scalar field. So the component mu is just the derivative of the field with respect to that direction. Then one can define this as another as a one form that we can call mu. No, so now this is what is written here. then one can use this the potency of the zero derivative to calculate an equation for that will a differential equation for J. Then one takes the derivative once more. This will be a two form that will be identically equal to zero, and that will contain the cross partial derivatives of J. And finally, well, these are all just all mathematical identities, let's say. But then, in order to write the actual wave equation, one needs to take the dual of this form and take the zero derivative, which is the equation that has been expressed here. So, well, I will not write it again because it is already written here. But so this is how the wave equation looks in terms of differential form. Then one can also write it in component forms, and it looks this way. So now we have this equation, and we do the same of we want to study in the real system, let's say. So we project it using the 3+1 formulation. So we define these projections with respect to the normal vector to the space-like hypersurface, and you also project it on the hypersurface, and you get this spatial purely spatial vector. So these equations then become this equation, and this other equation that is here doesn't come from here, but it actually comes from this identity. So this identity results in this evolution equation and also this differential constant. So it is similar to the system that we want to study here. But now, because we have expressed the system in terms of exterior derivatives, which are already integrants over submanifolds, we can just integrate these equations and get a discretization of the wave equation that will naturally fulfill the constraint. So in order to do this, we take the d derivative with respect to the time vector, and we use Cartan's magic formula that I showed before in order to transform this derivative, or well, this part of the equation onto exterior derivatives, and we have this equation. Now this is what is here is a scalar. So this already suggests if we integrate this over a submanifold, that can be this square, let's say this distorted square, because we are using some arbitrary coordinate. This already suggests which place in space will be taken by each of the different quantities. So this is the exterior derivative of a zero form, and is equal to 1 form. If one integrates this 1 form will become a line integral, so it will be the integral along this coordinate direction, for example. And this part will be, this is also a line integral, but because there is a exterior derivative inside, it is evaluated at the boundaries of this, and therefore it will be the points that are located at the extremes of that line. Finally, in this case, you have this is a 2 form, this is a 3 form. One integrates this, and then this part that was a 3 form becomes a volume, which is a manifold of dimension 3, and this is this region. And this other part, it is well, it is a 3 form that is exterior derivative of a 2 form. So when you integrate this will be evaluated at the boundary, and then therefore it will be the boundaries of this distorted cube. So then now we have achieved a discretization that naturally preserves the constant, but the price that we have to pay is that now every quantity is defined at a different spatial location. So if we do, let's say, plain finite differences, everything could be located at the same grid points. But now we have this density of kind of density located at the center of the cube, these fluxes located at the faces of the cube, these line integrals located at the edges of the cube, and these other scalars located at the corners of the cube. But actually, this is what one does in algorithms such as finite volume methods or constraint transport. And this is also why they are so good at preserving the constraints. In this case, you have a schematic representation of the finite volume algorithm. In the finite volume algorithm, what you do is that you have some amount of conserved quantity in all of the cells of the domain. You calculate the fluxes at the interfaces of these phases, of these cells, and because at the and time evolution consists in subtracting or adding the fluxes that are inside the different cells. So when you update the quantity U of the some conserved quantity, you will take out from this cell via this phase the amount of flux F. But this flux that is subtracted here will be added here, and therefore the integral of the conserved quantity over the domain will always be the same, up to the errors of the machine, so up to machine precision. The same is true for the case of the constraint transfer method, which is also is kind of the same of finite volume method, but one dimension lower. Instead of having two-dimensional fluxes and three-dimensional densities, one has two-dimensional magnetic fluxes and line integrals that can be, for example, the electromotive force in the case of the magnetic field. So we have now machine precision constraint fulfillment. Also, because everything is integrals, you really don't care about the shape of the grid cells. They can have any shape. This can be a cube that is distorted in any way you can imagine. So this also facilitates the use of these methods regardless of the shape of computational zones. So you can apply these methods to unstructured meshes, and this is precisely what we do in some codes evolving the MHD equations. And the price is indeed that quantities are defined at now a different spatial location. And then the question, yes,
so this quantity F that we saw on the previous slide. So how is this equation derived from the Baker equation? So this is all still from the Baker equation, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. So this was this is interesting because actually that epi is more like a definition of a part of the dual of this form. So I didn't write here the projections, but so this density that you can see here is a projection over the normal vector of the slice. So this is a scalar, and this F is the projection over the results of the projection in the other directions of the same form J. So so you can one can think of it as a flux vector, but everything is part of the same form J. So the rho and the F are just different projections of the form A. Sorry, of the form J. Right. So the question then is whether general relativity can be written in such a way as a system of equations in the zero derivative. And this is something that fortunately we didn't have to test ourselves, because there is actually already a formulation of general relativity in terms of zero derivatives. So to study this formulation, one needs to introduce some quantities. One has to introduce the connection forms, which are these omegas. Well, people, I'm sorry if I'm repeating this for the people that know very well general relativity. But then, so you have these omegas that are the connection forms that come from the covariant derivatives of the basis vectors. You also have this hypersurface form, which just measures the area or the volume actually of different hypersurfaces depending on the dimensionality. So one can have then one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or even four-dimensional. And so once having these definitions, and for the basis of one form theta, one can write a set of identities that are supposed to be fulfilled by any differentiable manifold. So these are the two Cartan structure equations. So the quantities here are the basis, the connection, and this quantity is defined by this equation to be the torsion. And here is the second Cartan structure equation, and this quantity is defined to be the curvature form. This is the metric, and this is the requirement that the manifold has to satisfy the metric compatibility. So from this curvature and torsion form, one can get the standard ways of representing curvature and torsion, which are the Ricci, the Riemann tensor and the torsion tensor. And also one can further take the exterior derivative of these equations and get what are called the Bianchi identities, which for in terms of the curvature, on the Riemann tensor look like this, but they are just the exterior derivative of the Cartan structure equations. So the previous slide contained mathematical identities, but now we want to introduce the physics. So the Einstein equations are equations that are followed by curvature. So we have to introduce the objects of which the Einstein equations work. So from the curvature form, we can obtain this other form that has the components of the Ricci tensor, this other form that has the components of the Ricci scalar, and this other form that has the components of the Einstein tensor. And as you can see, all of them are just products of the curvature form and the hypersurface forms. And now the part that is most that is less straightforward, let's say, but is the most interesting one, is that one can also define this other form that is called the Nester-Witten form, which is just also the exterior product of the connection and the hypersurface form. So having defined this form, we take its exterior derivative. We use the Cartan structure equations to develop it. And we have this term that is the Einstein tensor. We have this term that contains torsion, and therefore in general relativity we just remove it. Torsion is zero. And there is also this other term that contains products of the connection with itself, and this part is called the sparring form. So now we can use the Einstein equations to replace the Einstein tensor by the energy momentum tensor and get this energy momentum form. And then this equation looks like this. This is called the sparring equation. And because of this move that we have done to replace the Einstein tensor by the energy momentum tree form, we now have an alternative way of writing the Einstein equations. Right. So now we have something that looks extremely similar. Yes, sir? Which one? This one? So well, this is the exterior derivative of the Nester-Witten form. What is the small t? The small t? Here we have just this small t is everything that is in this square. This is the sparring form. So, well, now this equation looks extremely similar to the Maxwell equations. Not for the Maxwell equations in exterior derivatives look like this: the homogeneous Maxwell equations and the inhomogeneous Maxwell equations. So here is, well, so here is the field strength, here is the current. So, but we will see later why this is, well, we will see closer this analogy later in the slides. For now, the fact that it looks so similar to the Maxwell equations motivates the use of some names for some projections of this in the Rydberg formula. So if we write the Sparling equations in components, it looks like this. And we can then take these objects. It is important to say that they are objects, they are not tensors because they have an index that is non-tensorial. So we can take these objects and define some projections on the hypersurface. We can call this H, this D. These other projections of the so this is the list of the names for the projections of small p. The list of names or projections of the energy momentum tensor, and these are some other projections that are resolved the three-dimensional vectors, a collection of three-dimensional vectors. So if we then take these equations and project it, we have something that looks a lot like the gravitational and the Ampere-Maxwell laws, except that it is not the Ampere-Maxwell and the Gauss law, but it is the Einstein equations and the constraints or the Hamiltonian and momentum constraints. The relation to the usual projections is like this. So these are the usual name for this projection. This is the evolution equations, the momentum equations, sorry, the momentum constraints and the Hamiltonian constraints. So this, so one can easily write, convert between these equations and the Hamiltonian and momentum constraints and the Einstein evolution equation. So, another thing that is very interesting to see is that similarly as for the Maxwell system, where you take the zero derivative of this, and you get the conservation of current because this is double zero derivative, so this is zero. Also, for the case of general relativity, it works in exactly the same way, except that now the conserved quantity is the sum of the energy momentum form plus this small t, the Sparling form that we defined previously. And something that is actually very interesting is that this Sparling form, you can by writing it in different bases, you can construct what is called pullbacks. And the pullbacks of this Sparling form are related to different forms of writing the energy momentum in general relativity, like the Einstein tensor or the you get different names for the different kinds of definition of energy momentum in general relativity. And also, you can then use another derivative, another construction that is called the covariant X0 derivative that I have not defined, but you can believe me that if you employ it, you get these equations. And then you have here the statement that the sum of the matter and the gravitational energy momentum is conserved. And here you see how the exchange of energy and momentum between the matter sector and the gravitational sector goes, which is as we would expect via the coupling constant of the Einstein equations. So, but also the fact that we have this energy momentum conservation is nice from the numerical point of view because we have no source term. So one can have a machine precision plus conservative formulation. And having this, then there is also the possibility of generalizing to positivity preserving schemes that are applied, for example, in relativistic hydrodynamics in order to ensure that the energy and the momentum are all, maybe that the energy is always positive. So in the fluid dynamics, it's the energy and the density. But in this case, it would be that the energy is always positive. So, finally, in order to close the system, what we need to do is to choose a connection. In order to do this, so everything that we wrote before was assuming that we had a connection, but now we have to choose it, and here there are different choices. What we do is to do the simplest thing that one can do, the thing that would say most work, and then we define the connection to be what is called the spin connection, which is a connection that is totally antisymmetric. Then in this, the motivation for this choice is that one can write the Nernst-Witten form completely determined by the antisymmetric part of the connection. So we can just choose a connection that only has the antisymmetric part. So well, then we still have to choose something, because if you choose a spin connection, you need to choose a normal basis from which this connection comes. And again, just to save work, we decided to use the basis of the 3+1 adapted tetrad. So the time vector of the tetrad is just the normal vector to the hypersurface. Then we write things in this way, having the tetrad components as A. And this also just for convenience, because of the similarities that one sees with electromagnetism, but as we will see later. But the important thing is that the connection, the tetrad is defined in this way. You can get the metric in some sense as a square of these tetrad coefficients. So one can calculate from this the commutation coefficients, which are defined in this way. And well, here there is something that is from which we can also see the analogy between electrodynamics and this formulation, which is that this has exactly the same form as the definition of the electromagnetic field strength from the vector potential. So here, what we have in the gravity case, let's say, is the coefficients of the tetrads and the commutation coefficients. Here we have on the electromagnetic side, let's say, we have the electromagnetic vector potential and the field strength. So one can use this analogy again to name further projections. And in this case, the projections will have the familiar names E and D. So these are just the projections of these commutation coefficients that have been renamed as F, contracted with the normal vector of the hypersurface. And then we get the Cartan structure equation to look like this. So we have something that looks very much like the Faraday law, and something that looks a lot like the Gauss law for magnetism. But they are actually just the first Bianchi identities. So the Cartan structure equation plays the role of the definition of the magnetic vector potential, the electromagnetic potential. Then you take the exterior derivative of the first Cartan structure equation, and you get the Bianchi identities. You take the exterior derivative, the definition of vector potential, and you get the homogeneous Maxwell equation. So you get things written in this form. And so finally, in order to close the system, one needs to find a set of constitutive relations that relates the D and H fields that we use to write the Nernst-Witten form to the E and B fields that we use to write the projections of the connection, of the commutation coefficients. So well, we do this. It is a long algebraic problem, but it's an algebraic problem in the end, and you get with these expressions. I will not explain this on the several questions in the end. Well, and then finally, one can also rewrite the components of the Sparling form in terms of this projection. This is because they are written in terms of the connection, and the connection is written in terms of the commutation coefficients. So one can one can write it in this way, or in this way if you work with the four-dimensional objects. But the very interesting thing to look at it here is that in terms of this projection, the projections of the spiraling form look also a lot like the expression for energy and momentum in electrodynamics. So this kind of energy density looks a lot like the familiar E point D and BH of one of the ways of writing the energy momentum tensor for the electromagnetic field in material medium. Also, one can find this, which is the energy flux to a direction I, sorry. And this is nothing more than something that looks like a gravitational version of the Poynting vector, because this is in the end just E cross H. Right. So in the end, the final system looks like this. It has the first Cartan structure equations, the first Bianchi identities, the Einstein constraints, the Einstein evolution equations, and the second Bianchi identities. And well, this may still look unfamiliar if it is written in this index notation, but we can actually simply use the notation of vector calculus from that is normally used for electrodynamic theory. And so one has here the first Cartan equations that look like the definition of the electromagnetic vector potential. The first Bianchi identities that look like the Faraday's law and the Gauss law for magnetism. The Einstein equations that look like the Ampere-Maxwell law and like the Gauss law for electricity. And finally, the equations of conservation of gravitational and matter energy momentum, which look like the equations of the conservation of charge. Well, the only thing is that the complexity of the Einstein equations is hidden inside the constitutive equations that relate the E and B with the D and H. But this is essentially this is not only essentially, but this is general relativity, just written in a way that looks a lot like the Maxwell equation. And finally, we can get our long course of goal. We already achieved flux conserving formulation. Flux conservative formulation, sorry. We already achieved a first order system, and then we want to have a constraint preserving discretization. And this is what we do here. We apply exactly the same technique as what we did for the case of the wave equation that I told before. And we have a configuration where the different variables are scattered all over the place. But it is in principle constraint preserving. I don't know if I still have time to go to the last part, but
Okay, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, if you can.
yes. Well, here I wanted to just point a bit out the similarity between the electromagnetism and gravity, like to summarize a bit what I did and how come this works. So in the theory of electromagnetism, one can summarize the theory in this diagram. One starts with a potential. Then we take zero derivative and get the field strength. We take another zero derivative and we get the homogeneous Maxwell equation. But here in this part, we can use the constitutive relation to construct the field excitation. So the fields D and H that will give another set of two forms. We take a zero derivative again, get the inhomogeneous Maxwell equations, and take a zero derivative again and get charge conservation. So the traditional way of writing this diagram for the general relativity is what is here. This figure is from the book by Mr. Thorne and Wheeler. But if one uses as the basis variable the metric, then the diagram becomes a lot more complicated. You need to get two differentiation scales. You also need to get a double dual instead of a single dual, and this makes sense because the metric is to some extent like the square of the tetrad basis. So many things one could expect that they are applied twice, but also because in this form of looking at the theory, the object that plays the role of the Gauss potential, gauge potential, is not the Petrov coefficient, but it is the convention. So in part, this is why the Lagrangian indifferent is only first is only linear and not quadratic in the curvature, and you get well a system of equations that doesn't look like Maxwell equation. But if you instead take the Petrov basis as your gauge potential variable, you can construct things in this way. So you take a zero derivative. This is the commutation coefficient. Again, zero derivative, first Yankee identities. You, instead of the constitutive relations, you have the equations to write the spin connection. And then you construct the Nestor-Witten form. You exterior differentiate it, you get the spiraling or Einstein equation. And you exterior differentiate it again. And instead of charge conservation, you get the energy momentum conservation. Right. So to conclude, well, we have been trying to work on finding a formulation that is 3+1 that explores the analogies of gravity with energy and electromagnetism material media. The formulation is first order and flow conserving. It involves only differential form and zero derivatives, and it admits a natural machine precision constant preserving discretization. The caveat that we still need to prove is hyperbolicity, which is extremely important to have stable evolution. So this is basically the work we have been trying to do since 2022 when we published this paper. And well, some major challenge that happens is that if one naively takes the equations with some gauge and some arbitrary gauge and some other freedoms that one needs to adjust, it turns out that the system is not hyperbolic a priori. So there may be several things that one needs to tweak in order to recover the hyperbolicity. So because it is possible that by selecting some special gauge and also some special other freedoms that appear, one can get something that is hyperbolic, but at the moment it is not hyperbolic. But so I would like them to end the talk here. And well, hopefully this work, maybe we can have some nice system and some nice formulation to use for future implementations and for simulation of faster that system. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hector. We have a few minutes for questions. Not a lot. Yes.
In the famous thing, there is a problem in which it suggests that right equations for the dynamics in the fluid space-time in terms of some effective media. Effective index is space, and so on. Is it some relation to your formalism? Maybe it's somebody to a case of your formalism.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand very much the question. If there is a relation, or sorry,
Is there some relation between this effect described in your formalism? Maybe in somebody to a case.
well, to be sincere, I am not sure what problem precisely is written in the Landau's text that you made.
So he said you can write the movement of light in a medium instead of describing it as a refractive index. You can rewrite the refractive index in terms of a metric, as if light was moving in a metric.
I see. So to be sincere, I don't find like a very direct relation between this and this formulation. So I'm sorry that I cannot give an answer in this respect. Maybe I would need to know a bit more about this problem.
That you can find in So,
There's something that, well, I found interesting that may relate with a classical problem in electromagnetic is the question of how to write um, the energy momentum tensor of electromagnetic fields in a material medium in relativistic form. So I know that there are like two competing ways of writing the electromagnetic tensor. Sorry, the electromagnetic energy momentum tensor, but interestingly here, without doing any choice, the form that that this object has well for this system is the one that has the field strength multiplied by the field excitations. So yes, I don't know if this says something about well, if this can say something about classical electromagnetism, but I found interesting that among the two competing cases, well, the two competing versions, here this give one means one in particular.
So we have these conserved currents now, right? So that means there should also be some kind of conserved charge that you're conserving. So for the Einstein equations in this formulation, what are the conserved charges?
Well, in this case, they will be they will be the energy and the momentum given precisely in terms of the Landau-Lipschitz tensor. So not the Einstein tensor, but the ones that are given by the Landau-Lipschitz tensor. I think the Landau-Lipschitz one is a tensor, and the Einstein one is a pseudotensor. And this comes from the choice of connections that is based on tetrads. If one would have done the same but using instead of tetrads a coordinate basis, one would end with so the coefficients of the sparring form would be those of the Einstein pseudotensor. But then the equations would not be of conservation anymore. They would have some coefficients attached to the derivatives that cannot be removed.
Oh, there are several questions. I think he was first. Sorry.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm not very familiar with all these limitations, but from a plasma physics, the way that things relate back to the equations given with GR, so because the formulas we kind of extend a little bit was for the solver. For the solver. So it's kind of the solver where it's very similar to what you mentioned, where you have the electric and magnetic field.
That's the standard.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you are thinking of applying that same or a similar approach to this type of equation.
Exactly. That's precisely the goal of this. So because well, let's say in solvers for ideal MHD, one already has this infrastructure for evolving things in the finite volume way, so fluxes and densities, and in the let's say electromagnetic way, like we fields defined at the phases, magnetic fields at the phases, electric field at the edges, and so on. So in principle, the MHD codes that exist already have the infrastructure to solve well this kind of formulation. So the idea would be to try to recycle the techniques that are using MHD that have been developed over decades in order to solve the well simulations in general relativity.
Let us, because we have time for one last question, then we can follow after.
One
Personally.
question, probably I missed during your talk. But so if you align the timeline leg of your tetra to your one space, right? So in general, if you do that, there's no, I mean, at some point you have, there's always some condition there so that you have that this vector is hypersurface orthogonal, right? Because in general, if you just pick any timeline, it will not be, right? But where is that somehow hidden in what choice you have hidden that?
So this is, so well, the choice, this choice is reflected in having these components for the, I'm using the finger record. So this is by, this choice comes by having these components for the tetrad coefficients. So if you have them oriented in an arbitrary direction, there will be some other component, some other quantities here that will be the inner products between the normal vector and the time component of the tetrad. Well, interestingly, this choice is in part what allows the gauge to play the role of the scalar potential of electricity. But actually, now that we are concerned about hyperbolicity, we are thinking that maybe setting this choice of aligning the normal vector with the tetrad, with time component of, sorry, with the time vector of the tetrad is probably one of the things that prevents hyperbolicity in general. So I think it is possible, and what we should do is to explore other choices.
If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe.